One of the things that all my cars have in common is most definitely bad paint, and the usual way I went about solving this issue was just by simply not solving it. But I don't think you can blame me, because all the quotes that I received were more than the individual car was worth, which is understandable and yet financially silly. But because I'm also a combination of a cheapskate and a DIY fiend who last winter got hooked on painting my car in my garage videos, the idea of having a go at it myself and in the process saving some money and possibly acquiring a new skill seemed very appealing, which is why I decided to jump headfirst into the wonderful world of automotive painting.
Why?
As my first ever project in this field, I decided to paint some replacement panels for my precious little Twongi, because the originals were already too far gone. Of course, the simplest solution would be to just get new panels of the same color, but because the color the blue is sporting, the Renault Myosotis blue, which I prefer to call Renault Panel Van blue, is quite rare on Twongis, so getting new panels and painting them is more or less the only option. By the way, do you remember a while back when I got the tailgate for really cheap? Well, it was a package deal. The first and obvious step was to strip the panels of everything that would get in the way of painting, and also clean everything so the dirt won't clog up the sandpaper while sanding. But how much am I going to sand this? Well, from what I've heard, it's usually fine to paint over the existing paint as long as you scuff it up enough. That is, if the paint in question is still in good condition. I've had bad experience with paint on literally every Twongi I've ever worked on, and this hood is also no exception, which is why the original plan was to sand it to bare metal. And so, decked out in PPE and with a brand spanking new random orbital sander in hand, it was time to start the first of many hours of sanding in this project. And doing this, I learned a couple of important lessons. Firstly, that sanding to bare metal was a bit of an ambitious goal. Sure, the underside of the hood wasn't problematic, as I don't think it had any clear coat on it, but every other panel did, and so it took a lot longer to sand through it. So from then on, I limited myself to only sanding to primer. I also learned that it does really pay to be picky when buying the panels for your project and inspect them thoroughly for any dents and rust, because fixing all of that will mean extra work for you.
Serves me right for not checking.
Also check if the panel already had some bodywork done before, because if it did, you might run into some surprises.
I found a little Easter egg. This is filler over rust, because that's always worked in the past.
I was too excited by the good deal I was offered back then that I didn't check the paint thickness. Checking it now, it revealed that even though the additional paint isn't super thick, all of these panels have already been painted. It's also then not surprising that I ran into some filler on one of the doors. And because I didn't want to undo someone else's work, I decided to sand that door only through the base coat. I also underestimated how much dust this process was going to produce. The sander had a little pouch to collect it, but it filled up almost immediately. Because I got tired of cleaning the shop pretty quickly after doing the hood, I decided to do something different for the doors.
Is this Pontino?
I set up a little garden gazebo and wrapped it with this very thin foil, which also has a bit of painter's tape on one end. I got the inspiration from this short made by Colomotive, though mine is a lot simpler because I wanted to be able to set it up and put it away alone in under 30 minutes. And it worked well, even partially exposed to rain and ice. I also 3D printed an adapter to hook up a shop vac to the sander, and that dramatically lowered the amount of dust in the air. When everything was sanded to my satisfaction, I had to clean and degrease the surface. For that, I was just using a mix of distilled water and isopropyl alcohol, I think 70% alcohol and 30% water. And at first I was wiping with paper towels, but they were leaving too much lint, so I switched to microfibers later. Now we're getting to the fun stuff, spraying primer. Let's first talk about the primer itself. I'm using an epoxy primer. It's a 2K or 2-component, which means it needs a catalyst to get it going. This is my go-to primer because it offers great protection from rust. Sadly, there was no datasheet anywhere for this particular brand, so for everything except the mixing ratio, I was just winging it. I set the pressure to what it said on the gun, and how much of thinner I added was completely up to the vibes, so I had to try a couple of times before it felt right.
I don't know, still feels a bit wet. I mean, dense.
And now let's talk about what I use to apply it. This is a very simple, very cheap HVLP spray gun. It's something akin to what my American viewers can get at their Harbor Freight. It came with two different size nozzles and it cost 30 euros, everything included, so I couldn't really ask a lot from it. I was just hoping I'll be able to use it for practice and getting used to the technique of using it correctly. Obviously, I'm not an expert on this subject, so I don't know if it's a good spray gun for the job. Like most of the cheapest on the market, it's an HVLP, which stands for high volume, low pressure, and it's known to have quite high transfer efficiency, which means it operates at a much lower pressure than an old conventional spray gun and produces way less overspray. I was especially excited about less overspray because I was thinking I might not even need my DIY paint booth, but as you can see from the footage, the shop was getting quite foggy with overspray, so the paint booth was absolutely still necessary. I also bought a pressure regulator with a water catcher and filter. I've seen that most people use a small one that attaches directly to the spray gun, but this bigger one that plugs directly into the air supply was cheaper and more convenient. I'm guessing the hose in between the sprayer and the regulator has some kind of impact, but I don't yet know what it is, so someone in the comment section can probably tell me if and how bad I've done goofed. So, how is it painting for the first time? Well, there were certainly some growing pains, like how I didn't clean the sprayer enough and the needle wasn't sealing, or how I didn't tighten the nozzle enough so it started sputtering. I also completely underestimated how much paint I needed to mix up. Just for the underside of the hood, I mixed up a little under 250 milliliters, and that ended up being barely enough for 1.5 coats. I was using a 1.8 nozzle, but this consumption still seemed a bit much. I'd be really glad to get some feedback if what I was experiencing sounds about right. I obviously didn't have the professional painter stands to hang up these panels, so I had to just use what I had available. I also realized that I needed to tilt the panels as much as possible so that I can use up all of the paint in the cup. Because of my setup, I couldn't paint both sides at once, so in total I did 3 sessions of spraying primer, and on each one the quality of the finish varied. Some were okay, some were very orange peely, and some were just rough to the touch. I think the reason might have been the inconsistent amount of thinner I was mixing. There were some dust nibs and some runs which needed to be sanded off. I also used 400 grit to lightly wet sand the rough texture, so I could spot the dents a lot more easily. And I also learned a new lesson, that you should always sand across curved surfaces, not along, or else you'll end up with these low poly looking ass lines. Now we're moving on to my least favorite step, using body filler. And I will just warn you that if you're a professional automotive painter, you might want to look away for this next part, because there's a high chance it's going to make you cringe. You've been warned, it's gonna get pretty graphic. Okay, let me preface that this was my absolute first time working with filler, or Bondo as some people call it. And so I had quite a lot of problems. First, I want to talk about the mixing. I heard it's good if you mix it on baking paper, so I tried that first, but because it was attached to the desk with just tape, that didn't work. Also, I've heard that if you want to remove the filler from the applicator, it's best to let it dry and it'll just peel off. Which didn't happen, so I had to sand it off. Though now that I think of it, the applicators I was using weren't new, so someone might have already sanded them before, and that might be the reason the Bondo was sticking to them. Again, feedback appreciated. After the first failed attempt, I just mixed it on cardboard, which worked, but I later learned that's not the best practice, as cardboard might absorb the hardener, so I switched to baking paper stapled to cardboard. I can't say that there was much of a difference, mostly because there was just so many different variables from one batch to another, so I can't be sure what actually made the difference. Trying to hit the ideal mixing ratio was also a pain. It's supposed to be 2% mix, but it's hard to visualize that, though making a little pancake and smearing a thin bead across the whole diameter or a thicker bead across half the diameter was more or less the correct ratio. I tried to add a little less to give me more work time, but there was a very thin line where if I crossed it, it would just kind of half harden and stay like that. The opposite was also true for adding too much, it would just harden immediately. Eventually I got the feel for the ratio, and with practice I managed to mix it well in around a minute, which gave me a couple of minutes for the application. Speaking of application, that was definitely the worst part. No matter what I tried, I always got a super rough and porous texture, and the more passes I did, the worse it got. I still don't know the right technique, but what worked for me was that I really pressed the applicator into the surface hard, did as few passes as possible, and using a second applicator to clean up the main one in between passes. Also, it helped if I slid the applicator up before pulling it down at the start of the pass to get a nicer start. I honestly don't know what the correct way of doing it is. I tried following the tutorials on YouTube, but I just couldn't pull it off. One thing I did notice was that the filler I was using was a lot thicker than what I saw people on YouTube use. While theirs had more of a toothpaste consistency, mine was like Nutella, which was kept in a fridge. I later ended up buying another can of filler. The first one was advertised as Universal Soft and the second one as Fine. There was just barely any difference during application, but the second one was a little easier to sand. In the future I will buy and try some filler from a more premium brand to see if it makes a difference. I don't know why, with my absolute zero Bondo experience, I thought it would be a good idea to fix a bodyline that somebody already butchered before me. I made an absolute mess of it, had to sand most of it off in the process, reapply primer, add additional filler, shape and sand that, then spray it with spray filler, fill in the porosity that showed up, respray the spray filler, and then I could finally call it good-ish. This was an absolute slog and it took forever. It didn't help when I occasionally mixed too little or too much hardener and had to fix all that. I think the most problematic spot on one of the doors I had to apply filler at least 10 times, so trust me when I say it was not fun.
This was not my finest work.
I kind of mentioned it before, but the next step was spraying spray filler. This is kind of like primer and some of them can be used as a primer. But the main purpose of this is to smooth out any small imperfections still left in the body filler and to be sanded down to a nice smooth surface for the paint. I mixed it according to the instructions on the can.
Just a smidge more. That's a good smidge.
And was still using the 1.8 nozzle size. At that point I have gotten pretty used to using the paint gun and I didn't get any runs, though the paint might have needed a bit more thinner because the final finish was very rough. But that didn't matter because it was going to get sanded anyway. To see what I was doing, I gently misted the panels with a black spray can as a kind of DIY guide code, so I could see what still needed to be sanded. I was wet sanding this with 400 grit, and I know I could have used the orbital sander for this, but I kinda wanted to do it by hand to have more control, and I also wanted to keep the dust to a minimum. I used a sanding block for the straight sections and a sponge for the curves. The trade-off of doing it by hand was that it took ages, but at least it was Christmas, so I had some delicious Lebkuchen to keep me going.
Lebkuchen.
I also learned a valuable lesson with sandpaper. You really get what you pay for. The cheap stuff didn't last that long and it even started disintegrating, while the more expensive stuff lasted way longer. I did another pass with 600 grit and so I got a relatively nice and smooth finish. For the underside I didn't bother that much, I just lightly scuffed up the primer with 400 grit and a scotch pad. The panels were then cleaned and degreased. I was still able to paint only one side at a time, and because overspray was actually an issue this time, me and my dad masked the outer side, thinking if I mess up on my first go it would be better to do it on the inner side. The panels were therefore prepped for paint, but I can't say the same about the paint booth. Because I didn't have any ventilation installed, the best I had was opening the garage door a little bit to let some fresh air in, so there was quite a lot of dust and other dirt in the booth, which also showed up in the last layer of spray filler. To minimize that, I decided to wash the booth. At first I thought I could reuse the plastic foil, but because I couldn't quite clean it thoroughly enough, I decided to just put a new one around for the sake of a better paint job. Alright, with all the preparations in place, it was finally time for what you've all been waiting for. The paint. I got a whole paint can mixed at a local paint shop and the guy working there was super nice and even gave me some tips, so I really recommend them. The paint I went with is a 2-component acrylic single stage paint, which is kind of like base and clear coat mixed together. I went with this because it's the simplest paint to apply, where you only need to spray it once and you're done. I don't know if it's necessarily the easiest to spray, but my goal was to minimize the number of steps where I could mess up. Because I was now spraying paint, which is thinner than primer, I switched to the 1.4 nozzle and I also had to adjust the pressure. The parts were then set up, cleaned and degreased in the booth, so it was finally time to put down the paint. Thanks to having a little bit more practice under my belt, I can say that it went quite smoothly and I didn't have any issues with the paint gun. The inner side turned out quite nice if you ignore all the dust nibs in the paint, but the outer side was quite a bit more orange peely. My two theories are that I didn't add enough thinner in the second batch, which is weird because I definitely added the 10% like specified. If anything, I think in the first batch we mixed up a little bit more than that. Or maybe I let it sit for a little too long in between coats. You're supposed to wait 10 to 15 minutes and I think I was definitely more towards the 15-minute mark, because I only started noticing the orange peel when adding the second coat. But I'm not super bummed out about it. I expected I was going to have to cut and buff orange peel, which is why I applied 3 coats. And even though I cleaned the booth again before painting the other side, there were still many dust nibs in the paint. But I guess it's to be expected because this is still far from an ideal painting environment. Interestingly, this was also my first time during this project where I actually had some leftover paint, which would mean that the smaller nozzle has lower paint consumption. Another thing I noticed is how much overspray this makes. It went everywhere, on the floor, the walls, the spray gun. The squeaking sound you hear when I'm moving is the paint sticking to my shoes, which were actually black before I started painting. Which is why I'm actually considering getting one of those paint suits in the future. Also, the paint that got on the walls started blocking the light, so after a couple of coats it got really dark and I had to whip out my phone to see what I was doing. So some kind of light in the booth would be great, or perhaps even a headlamp. Now the only thing left to do was to get rid of the old and rusty panels and put the new ones on. Overall, I am pretty satisfied with how it turned out in the end. Of course, I still need to cut and buff everything to get rid of the orange peel, and I need to add the texture film on the A-pillar. But I will do that later. I still want to paint the bumper and the fuel filler cap, which broke off when I needed it as a color template, and when that is all done, I'll polish the whole car. There is also a little bit of a difference in hue between the old and new paint, which I'm hoping will be less apparent after the car is all polished. Now, what about my experience? This whole process was pretty repetitive, tedious and tiring, but at the same time I can't say that I didn't enjoy it. I am weird like that, where I find repetitive jobs like sanding and polishing weirdly therapeutic, so I think I'm going to be painting more things in the future. Though there are definitely some changes I want to make to speed up the process. For one, I want to use more of the orbital sander when sanding, so it won't take quite as long. I want to get another and possible better paint gun. This one is alright and does the job, but it has its quirks. But again, that's something you deal with a €30 paint gun. I also want to get a disposable cup system to make cleaning quicker and easier. It would be great to get some panel stands, but it's not exactly necessary. They are expensive to buy, but there is also an option of making my own. Also, some proper ventilation in the paint booth would really go a long way. And like I said before, I really want to try some different brands of body filler to see if it's any easier to work with. The main goal of this endeavor was to learn to prep and paint for results acceptable for nuggets and potential drift cars, and I think I more or less achieved that. I hope you enjoyed this little training exercise, and I would like to thank you for watching. I would also like to thank you for providing feedback and tips in the comments so I can get better at this. That's all for now, and like always, I would like to wish you a great rest of your day.